Hello, this is Gary Garrett from Otis College. If you watched part 1 of this video about line character, you would have seen how to build a practice in learning what line does in building a drawn form and how that simply translates in a creative skill that helps you sketch mechanical and organic objects. In this video, though, we will deal just with building line character to create a dynamic figure drawing. What certainly would help your drawing practice reach a higher level is to study how other artists draw and to get a good grasp of anatomy and anatomical structure. Anatomy is important because the model moves, various landmarks will appear, and there will be subtle and large changes in form, and you'll have to translate to the universe of various lines and marks. Before we start, a couple little pieces of house cleaning. I had to gray the paper down so the lines show up a little bit more. So if the paper looks a little bit on the dull side, look very closely. You'll see a lot of subtle little marks showing up that if I was to go for the white paper, they would have disappeared. Second of all, I'm using the photograph just for reference. I'm changing it, moving it around for my needs. Remember, I'm doing an interpretation of the photograph, not a rendering of it. Also, I slowed down the process. This is really only about a 5-minute long drawing, but I slowed it down so you'll be able to see the strokes and the marks and how they build up. So if you look at the drawing and the diagram, you'll see that I'm just using the skeleton as a basic framework. I'm not drawing much of the outside contour line. What I'm doing is creating a pathway using the skeleton and where it comes to the surface to help guide me. I'm not paying too much attention to the form at this point. What I'm doing is getting the landmarks like the feet, the hands, the shape and size of the head, the rib cage, and the pelvis to help guide me proportionally. Again, it's important to remember that you can go back to the diagram, freeze the frame, and make comparisons at any time. And then you can make comparisons between my drawing and the diagram. So at this point, we bring another artist's work into the mix. This is his version of skeleton. Now there's some things I'm not too crazy about in this drawing, this diagram that is, but at the same time, there's not one size fits all. Try different methodologies and see what works for you. Now we're going to change back to my diagram again so you can see how the skeleton's being built up a little bit more. You can see I'm trying to get the size of the kneecaps in comparison to the hip, in comparison to the rib cage and the head. You also may notice that I'm not drawing them a strict anatomical ribs in the rib cage and the bony pelvis. I'm turning it into like sort of a bean or a oval with a box with another circle for the head or an oval for the head. So what you may notice at this point is I'm measuring in the legs, looking at the width to the length ratio, and just not even trying to draw the leg in this organic quality, but just get it as sort of a tube. And you can see the tube man to the left. And what that diagram shows is just the basic simplicity of the forms to make it a little less complicated. What you might see at this point, though, is the ellipses from the last lesson showing up. That's how you're getting the basic form, showing how that lines wrap around form, wrap around volumes to give it the idea of one thing overlapping another. You might also notice I'm drawing everything like glass, where you can look through and see the arm behind the leg, the head behind the shoulders, one leg popping up on the other side of the pelvis. This is where I can keep everything in line and in track, so then as I'm going and commit to different areas, I can see the relationship between everything. Now you can see I'm getting a little bit more confident about where everything's going. I'm sort of just really lightly knocking in the proportions of the legs, accenting the ankles, where the bone's coming to the surface. You can see the darker line is where that bone and where the Achilles tendons pops, where we want to hit the foot and make it touch the ground a little bit more. Those angular bones come to the surface, so as you put the line quality down, what you're going to do is make them a little bit more jagged and the lines a little bit more short and staccato. The upper legs have a little bit more meat to them, so there's not as many hard edges, so therefore the line's going to be a little bit more softer, a little bit more rounded, a little bit more diffused. Okay, so now that I can see the relationship where everything's being going to fit in, I'm going to concentrate on two places, in the rib cage and the legs. And here's some basic blockouts of the legs. Your typical anatomical chart and then a drawn one on the far right in the diagram page. So I've slowed this video down so you'll be able to see the way I make these lines. I'm going twice as fast as this, making much quicker decisions. One point you may notice is that I'm really starting to use the anatomy on here. So I have the tendons on the back of the kneecap. Squareness of the kneecap as it is. Achilles tendons where the ankles are coming out, starting to build up the boniness of the shoulder, going around the rib cage, going around the pelvis a little bit more, sort of accentuating the overlaps, getting more of a handle on what conceptually I want to do with the drawing. So also, if you look closely, you'll see that I don't just commit to one outside contour line. What I do is I kind of build the line up, compare and contrast what's around it to see what punches more or what needs to go into the background. You might notice the back leg, the one that he's standing on. The upper part of the leg, there's hardly anything. It's just a ghost. It's the one that's in the foreground, or the one that's a little bit more tense, that I'm more focused on. One thing you're doing as an artist in interpreting this is that you're editing and you're accentuating what you're seeing, right? Not just off a photograph, but the real figure. So I've had a chance to do some actual anatomical muscle and skeletal studies from cadavers, which is extremely interesting, but it really teaches me exactly how all of this stuff fits together. So then when I draw a figure, I'll be able to take action on what my intent is. Now there's a couple of big accents I'm starting to bring into this drawing. One is, what I'm doing right now is I'm drawing a light cone, and the light's coming down on the back of the figure, which means the shadows are underneath the forms. You can even see that in that little diagram I have to the left. The darker area is underneath where the shadow is. The light is filling the top of the figure, so therefore you keep those lines lighter and you keep those top planes more open and you don't fill them as much. You might also see at this point I'm really pushing the overlaps. How one form goes in back of another, how one line is different from another. You'll see the top of the leg is very light. The arm that goes behind it has darker line. The neck is dark where it goes into the chin. So what I'm doing is making sure that the line quality doesn't equate all the way through. Is that what you do? Is you get dynamic forms blasting into one another. Different lines coming together and telling you different stories in the drawing. At this point I'm soon going to be moving up into the arms, and it's a relatively small drawing, so even though in the diagram there's a lot of detail and a lot of muscle, I'm not going to be putting that much into those arms. I'm just going to tell the story of the length of the arms, the overlaps, and what musculature that I can actually draw there without it gets to be too much. If I clog it up with a bunch of lines and I don't get the bigger picture, then it's not going to make any sense. Simplicity and communication is one of the most important parts of what when you do here, is that you're going to see a lot of things that you're going to have to edit for clarity. At this point I'm trying to button up the whole drawing. So I'm moving contour to the inside, accenting the chest, accenting the overlapping in the leg, pulling out a little bit more of that sort of diffuse line where the form changes and rounds out underneath the legs. Now my eye is bouncing all over the form, so now what I'm doing is going in and knocking in the feet a little bit more, going up to the hands, up to the head, and again making it a whole composition. I'm making sure all the elements work in concert rather than one element taking over the entire composition. So now we return to our original diagram that I started with, and you can see where we've come from. Again, very simplified. Remember, it's a demo drawing. What I'm doing now is I'm really punching up the overlaps. So maybe you can see how I've taken that rounded rib cage there and diffused the line and then brought it down into that sharp line for the stomach, and then plowed that into the rounder area of the pelvis, then down through the softness of the leg again. Changing up my line quality all the time as I work through it, and depending on what kind of dynamics are going on in the pose and with the model. So let me show you what my intent was. The A on that ankle is where it overlaps. There's a lot of weight being put on that, so there's a lot of staccato line. B, that's where the foot hits the ground. Again, sort of a darker line. So we go to C. You can see how light that arm is in relationship to the leg in front of it. It makes it go into the background. So at this point there's that nice little negative space where the neck is, where the chin juts out, where the shoulder is. I'm going to make sure that I show the audience that as being an important part of the overlapping. Again, where the butt cheeks are, where the leg goes back underneath. Again, that whole series of linear overlaps that are diffused lines. F and G is where the arm overlaps the torso and overlaps the shoulder and the head. So the last point is that hand at the end of the arm, that accents the gesture of that entire upper part of the body, and I use sharp staccato lines around the bones of the hand to give it a little bit more accent. So we're going to move on to the female figure at this point. Here's a gallery of different poses from 2 minutes to 10 minutes long, so you can look through and refer to after the video is over. And what's important again is the rhythm and the movement and the clarity of the entire form in action. So again, just a little reminder, I kept the paper a little bit grayer, exposed it a little bit less, and also slowed down the video so you'll be able to see the mark making and the process. So in the process, very similar to the last drawing, what I'm doing at this point is just mapping out the form. I think there's going to be a little bit more attention to the shoulders and the arms on this drawing as opposed to the last one. So what I'm doing at this part of the drawing is just letting the pencil roam over the top. There's no real time limit in this. So what I'm doing is building my lineup. You can see I'm changing the hand position. Sometimes it's going to traditional, sometimes to the open palm technique. I'm building up the anatomy. There's a pelvis going in there. Then I move down the femur and the tibia, which are the leg bones, down into the feet, anchor into the feet a little bit more, accent them a little bit more. I'm using that shadow that's on the figure of where the bone comes to the surface or has effect on the surface. You'll see I'll be boxing out the legs a little bit more to differentiate them from one another so they don't blend together. It'd be easy to get these two legs to blend together, and that's why I'm spending more time to sort of break them apart a little bit more and make them a little bit more each unique. One important point you might notice, I'm using those tubes that we did last drawing to sort of organize my principles there and to make sure that, again, the ellipses go around the corners so they're more three-dimensional. And I also bring up this drawing that I did on the left and a diagram on the right to show you how complicated it actually is and how simple that you have to actually make it so it will communicate right. So I am also building up the rhythm at this point because I have to make this transition from the legs up into the shoulders and into the arms. So where you'll see me start to sort of punch the overlaps a little bit more, get the torso to kind of fit into the lumbar region, to fit into the top of the pelvis. There you can see with those arrows, that's where that is. Perhaps you might see with the line quality, the right side of the figure is pulling and stretching, so it's got that long rhythmic line as opposed to the left hand side, which is turning, so you get these smaller sort of curving, overlapping forms that show a little bit more bump and a little bit more curve to them. It makes for a much more sophisticated drawing than just putting a big ugly outline on it. So moving on to the arms, you can see I'm using those basic elliptical forms, those tubes, to organize my measurements and my proportions, and especially the overlaps, because I've really got to get the idea that these arms are stretching out and reaching for something. Now, a really important anatomical point that I haven't talked about a lot is this thing called the scapula. It's that wings on the back, that bone, that triangular bone that fits up over the top of the rib cage into the shoulder. And that's where those muscles attach to, and you can see the pull and the stretch that I'm trying to get off that. But I also know that I can't get a really heavy line there because then the arms would completely detach away from the rest of the body. So I have to put a passageway there through all the different pieces so visually they hold together. This is where that light logic and line quality and anatomy all comes together, is that the lights on top of the forms means that you're not putting a lot of detail there. You have to make, again, like I said, you have to make these like little passageways, these little weaves through it. If you create like really abrupt walls, none of the form can visually flow, so it looks kind of dead and unreal. So again, it's not a perfect representation of the pose, but you can see the diagram of the tube woman that's there. You can see the idea, the concept behind it, where it sort of holds everything together. All the pieces communicate with one another and form a bigger picture. It's one of the things you have to kind of keep in mind when you're using this line quality is if you put shadows in or you build up weight underneath forms. And again, you're not just putting one stroke down, you're building lines up as you go along and making sort of big decisions and then small little adjustments throughout the drawing. I think one of the most important parts is to make sure the thing reads as a whole, that you don't really get stuck on individual details that will make the eye wander to somewhere that you perhaps might not want it to go. So in my drawing at this point, you can see the overlaps in the shoulders, you can see that line down into the rib cage, down into the pelvis, then down into the legs, into the feet, and then back up the other side into the armpit, into where the arm overlaps the shoulder, where the neck is overlapped by the shoulder, and where the head fits together. And then behind the head, you can see there's almost no line whatsoever, so it just sort of drifts into the background and becomes more atmospheric. At this point, perhaps you can see one of those little accents I wanted was that arm coming down and latching onto the top of the shoulder and then turning sideways and then up underneath the neck and then back down on the right hand side. So I want the eye to go down the rib cage, into the lumbar region, up over the hip, down into the legs, and then visually come right back up to the shoulder where all the overlaps are. One of the best concepts is to keep the eye rolling and moving through the composition so it doesn't get stuck on any particular little point or even little mistakes. So at this point the lesson ends, and I added a little gallery to the end so you could refer back to and take a look at different kinds of line quality. These again are very quick drawings, the longest being about 10 minutes long, the shortest being 2 minutes long, done with different media, pencil, colored pencil, graphite, even watercolor pencil. Thanks again for watching. If you like it, leave a comment. Please refer to the other videos I've made as well, and I'll see you later. Thank you very much. Bye.